Thanks for everybody's stories. This is kind of a personal story. I call it, it's kind of it's a tragedy. It's a love story. It's kind of a detective story and a coming to be story. I think the tragedy we all know, we've heard of the news, and it's something that probably a lot of people knew, but it's become refreshed for people, and it's very hard to come to grips with the story of our country and the legacy. But the love story I want to talk about was my falling in love with First Nations stories. Well, I could just say, first of all, I'm a child of the 60s. I kind of grew up in the 60s, and I think in the late 60s, I first came across, I think maybe some people might remember the movie Little Big Man came out, and there's another movie, A Man Called Horse, but stories of white settlers who encountered First Nations people and were changed by their experience. And it really intrigued me. I was really, something in it really struck a chord with me. And I can't say that I explored it to a great deal, but it just stuck with me. And then I worked in the prisons for about 10 years. And while working in the prisons, I worked in Kingston Penitentiary. And I don't know if people have ever been there, but it's now closed. And it's basically a tourist area where people can look how horrible prisons were. But I had the privilege of being invited there to take part in a sweat lodge with First Nations inmates and an elder from outside the community and a priest. I think it was the prison priest. And it was such a powerful experience of, there we were, a very small group of us there huddled together in the heat. And it was just so powerful. And I recall the priest afterwards saying to me that he found that the First Nations spirituality, the physicality of it really spoke to him more deeply than his own faith that he was professed to share in the prisons. Anyway, that stuck with me, that experience. And then I guess I became a storyteller. I started to become a storyteller in the mid 90s. And or it was around that time. And I moved to Richmond Hill and then Newmarket, and had kids. I became a Cub and Scout leader. And I started to tell stories to the Cubs and Scouts. And so I started to explore, what kind of stories would be good. And of course, they're Jungle Book stories, but we happened to have this Aboriginal awareness badge back in those days. I think they still have it actually. So I went to the Newmarket Library and I found these series of books on First Nation stories. And honestly, I don't think those same books are there anymore. I think they're written by a settler. But I just found those stories so powerful. Like I read the stories and the stories, many of them were about the environment, relationship with the environment. I just found them so powerful. And I started to tell them to the Cubs and Scouts, or that time they were Cubs, my son was in Cubs. And I went to some event, it was a small event, and there was another leader there. These were a number of Cub packs. She heard me telling, and she said, "Oh, we're having this First Nation Jamboree. That's the theme. And would you tell these stories there?" And at that time, honestly, anyway, this is my story of where I was at that time. I just felt honored to be asked. And I just loved those stories so much, because the thing about the stories were why I found them so powerful. They were about learning from their relationships with the natural world. There were stories of brokenness and stories of coming together and reconciliation. And so there was so much in them. And I felt that when I told them, and even telling them, had an impact on me. So I agreed. So I go to this event, and I don't know if people know Burles Creek Center, this is where the Rolling Stones hold their concerts. It's huge. This was a huge event. Maybe several thousand Cubs and Scouts there. So it started with a First Nations drumming, and I was just there with everyone else listening, and it was so wonderful. And I guess this is another thing I want to share, is that what has made me have so much affection and love for the First Nations is just their spirit. Like the drummers were up there, they were young men, and they're drumming for all the Cubs and Scouts, and they started the drum beat, and they asked people if they knew any drum beats. And somebody said, oh yeah. And he said, where'd you learn it? And they said, oh, Disney movies. And he kind of laughed and he said, yeah, that's where most people learn. And then he showed the drum beat and it was so powerful. And so all of us were out there dancing and just moving to the drums. And that took about maybe half an hour. And then I moved to my spot over to the side where I was telling stories. And honestly, for about 3 hours, I told stories to, I don't know how many Cubs and Scouts. And meanwhile, all around me, there was the sound of drumming. There was First Nations people doing crafts. And inside, I was starting to feel like there's something a little bit wrong. I don't know, maybe a little bit wrong. There's something wrong here. Anyway, the whole weekend was a wonderful experience for the Cubs and Scouts. But I came away, thinking, what was I doing? So not a short time after that, I'm a youth employment counselor. I went to an event and there was a First Nation elder who was teaching grandfather's teachings. And I had a chance to talk with her and I shared with her my experience. And I asked her, is it right for me to tell these stories? And I was really struck by her response. It wasn't like, what are you doing? No, it's wrong. It was so gentle. It was just like, you know what? Those are our stories. Those are sacred to us. Really, you should find your own stories. What are your stories? Your people, wherever you come from, probably were once Indigenous. What are your stories? And so I remember asking another elder and some other people the same question, and the same answer came to me with a similar kind of attitude. It wasn't like, how dare you? It was like, find your own stories. And so for a while, I was kind of grieving. Like I talked to a friend and I said, I can't tell these stories anymore. And my friend said, don't they want to hear their stories told? But you know what? A short time later, I had the good fortune, long time after that, that question was in my mind. What are my stories? And, my own heritage, I've told this, many of us here are probably the same. It's probably Celtic, Irish, Scottish, a little bit of French, something like that. But I had the good fortune to join the Storytelling Orillia. I'd been in another group before that and it ended, and I was looking for a new storytelling community. And I joined this community, which was just a wonderful community. You're seeing it today. And I had the good fortune of telling stories and hearing stories alongside, as some people have said, Mark Douglas. And before there was another First Nation teller, Dave. And even others of us who told stories, just for a spirit that was open to the First Nations. And I guess this has been part of my journey. I still haven't got in touch with what it means for me to be Indigenous. I still have to explore my Celtic roots. And someone here, I was talking to Jan the other day, and she said that probably in that, maybe I have a spirit name or a spirit animal that I could find. And so that's part of my search. But I think I'm so grateful for, the questions that were, that experience and realizing these are not my stories to be told. But at the same time, I can hear those stories. They're not stories that are denied to me. They're out there and they're continually being told. As Sue said, the story she heard about creation was so beautiful. And it's so right when it's told by someone, a First Nation person. And the other thing I love about storytelling is that, yes, there's stories from the past, but storytelling is something that's alive. That's something that the First Nations tell us, that storytelling, there's a magic to storytelling. It brings the world to life. And what I learned from the First Nation stories it's about paying attention to life, to nature, to the people around us, and learning from it and sharing those stories. And so I feel like I'm on this journey. I love the expression. I'm going to try to say it. Gama da Dizamin. I don't know if I'm saying that quite correctly, but I'm trying. But I'm really excited to be on this journey. And I realize that what we've done together is part of that journey. Just sharing these stories has been such a wonderful process to share and learn from each other. And yeah, so that's the story I wanted to share. Miigwech.
Thank you, Tim. And I just learned from my Anishinaabemowin teacher that Miigwech means that's enough. In a good anyway, it's like, that's enough. What you've done is enough, you know? So it's like, thank you. So thank you, Tim.